Ryan Holiday, welcome to the Dispatch podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, I want to get started with a newsletter that you wrote really recently. You wrote about a few ways to prepare for the next 4 years. One of those ways was how not to be cynical. How can we do that? How can we not be cynical with the next 4 years?
Look, if it was easy, I probably wouldn't have needed to write that. I've always found, do you know who Ambrose Bierce is? He's
No.
a great writer. He's a contemporary of Mark Twain. He wrote this, he's famously known as a cynic. He wrote this book called The Devil's Dictionary. Anyways, you tend to read cynics and you think that they are nasty and negative, but often cynics become cynical because they were once idealistic, right? And that idealism was spurned or betrayed or broken. If you don't give a shit and you don't care, in some ways that protects you from cynicism because you have nothing to disillusion you. So I think it's hard not to be cynical in a world where you're watching literal criminals get ahead and you're watching some of the dumbest people be promoted to positions of incredible responsibility and complexity. That being said, part of the reason we're in this mess is because people were cynical and they said stuff doesn't matter. And so it kind of becomes this wicked feedback loop. And there's something fundamentally courageous about clinging to ideals and principles when everyone around you is giving up on them. And I'm not saying things are awesome, and I'm not saying they're not going to get worse. They probably will be. But one way we can ensure that they get worse faster is for good people to give up and to, accept that as a foregone conclusion.
So, what are some practices, do you think, to not be cynical? Like, is there something that you do every day where you're like, you wake up in the morning, you look in the mirror, and you're like, today I will be positive? No?
Yeah,
Just an idea.
I'm not repeating aphorisms in the mirror, but I am repeating principles to myself. I think
Yeah.
I try to earnestly care about one's self-improvement is a strike against cynicism. To believe that progress is possible even on the individual level is a meaningful contrarian blow, I think. So I try to journal. I try to read great works of art and literature. I try to study philosophy. I try to ground myself in the ideas and the works and the presence of people who really did make a difference, who really did care about things, who really took things seriously, as opposed to, waking up and mainlining cable television or Twitter or, the things that, it's so much easier to subject yourself to. And I think certainly contribute to the cynicism. Like, we have one of the wonderful things about the internet. The internet has had so many negative consequences for society, but one of the things it does is put at our fingertips the greatest thinking that humanity has ever produced, all in one place. And so you can wake up and subject yourself to Twitter anons and, influencers and activists and shit posters, and you can expose yourself to all that, and I promise you it will contribute to your cynicism. Or you can say, hey, I want to sit down with Aristotle, or I want to sit down with Washington, or I want to sit down with even just an earnest politician not that long ago, like a Jimmy Carter or a Truman. Like I want to subject myself to good ideas from good people, and that's I'm going to allow in. Like, we don't control what's happening in the world, but we do control to some degree what our inputs are, and I don't think people are protective enough of those inputs.
So let's talk about one of those inputs, which is news. And you also wrote that you're turning off the news. But I won't tell you what you told me right before we started, which was one of the places that you subscribe to.
I've subscribed to the Dispatch since it started. I think newsletters are for the most part great. I'm a little concerned with some of the Substackification of the world, where people think that that they're getting the truth from people who are now sort of captured by their audience and in love with their own contrarianness. But I've just never met a person who got smart watching television news. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Smart people are smart because they read lots of books about a thing, and then they buttress that knowledge with real firsthand experience. Um, I think people are consuming way too much real-time information. You know, um, we are consuming information that is breaking, and by definition of it being breaking, uh, it is likely to be rendered irrelevant by subsequent breaking news. And so one of the things I like about great newsletters is that they digest, even at a 24-hour distance, what the news of the day. But I think the best journalism and certainly the best writing is designed to hold true over a long period of time. My friend Morgan Housel said to me once, I was interviewing him in this room, he was like, if I think back, I can't remember a single news article I read 10 years ago, but my life was profoundly changed by books I read 10 years ago. And so I think people are just consuming way too much contemporary information and not enough information that's designed first and foremost to be worth paying for now, but to have continued to hold its value over a long period of time.
I agree with that because my background was a TV news reporter. And so I kind of had to step back from the breaking news side of things. How have you navigated the political turmoil of this time, and how has that affected any friendships or family relationships that you've had, given your specific philosophy of kind of stepping back when people seem to step a little bit forward?
Well, it's challenging. I write about ancient philosophy, and part of ancient philosophy is about sort of turning inwards and tuning out what doesn't matter. We were just talking about that. At the same time, I don't think you can just go, "Hey, politics is out in the world and doesn't really matter." So it's how do you strike this balance between both being informed and being above the fray? That's certainly something that I struggle with. But I grew up in a conservative place. I am, I would say, liberal to center left, and I live in rural Texas, and I have for a long time. So I've always been a bit, not at odds, but sort of one foot in, one foot out. Always been spending time with friends, with neighbors, with people that I disagree with on a lot of things. And most of the time it doesn't come up at all, right? Most of the time you have much more practical concerns. I I try to do my best to talk in my own work, not about specific policies, which I don't honestly know that much about. And I try to talk about principles and ideals and just sort of basic social contract stuff. And I think one of the really tricky parts about where we are politically right now is that we're not disagreeing over a, a 30% income tax and a 27% income tax. We're arguing over how much money is it going to cost to deport 10 million people, right? Like we're arguing over basic social contract stuff. We're arguing over whether the president can punish their political enemies. We're arguing over whether it's illegal if the president does it, right? Like we're arguing over whether you can call the president a rapist or not, and whether that's legally true or not. So we're just so beyond what you would say is sort of your day-to-day political disagreements. And I think we're in the territory of just basic human decency and social contract stuff. And I find it hard not to talk about that. And I find it hard to just go, let's agree to disagree when we're finding ourselves at disagreements such as that.
So this is going to be like a hard turn, but I want to move on from like this political conversation that we just had to ambition, to get to some of our to most of our audience who are pretty ambitious people. You've had a successful career, but it's kind of like the path wasn't straightforward to author, Stoic
Sure.
philosopher living in rural Texas. Um, was ambition a part of that for you? And I imagine that it still might be, but at what point were you like, this is ambition, and then maybe because of how your career kind of moved, that it might have switched to something more than just ambition?
Yeah. I would certainly say I was very ambitious in my late teens, early 20s. I wanted to get out of where I lived. I wanted to go do something different. I wanted to be in control of my own destiny. There were like accomplishments that I wanted to check off the list. And when you are fortunate enough to be able to realize some of those accomplishments, especially early on, you have this interesting experience where it's almost never what you thought it would be, or it almost never does for you what you think it would do. And you can kind of go two ways after that. You can say, oh, it just needs to be bigger. It just needs to be more. It just needs to happen again and again and again, and then it will make me feel good. Or you can go, maybe wasn't the accomplishment that I needed in the first place. One of the things the Stoics talk about is like what part of this is in your control. And I think I have gotten better and learned more. Like I would say I'm more ambitious as a writer than I was earlier, but I am less ambitious as an author, if that distinction makes sense. Like I am more ambitious in how good I want to be and how I want to push myself and how I want to get closer and closer to whatever capacities I have as a person and as a person in a craft. And I am much less interested in accolades, sales, accomplishments than I was.
Mhm.
So I feel like sometimes these line up. I feel like the book I just did was my best book. Like I grew the most as a person and as a writer doing it. And that it debuted at #1 on the New York Times list was cool. That was one of the cases where it overlapped. But more often than not, those two things are not in alignment. And or they are independent variables that have very little to do with each other. And so I would say that my ambitions have become more internal and less external. And in that way, I guess I would say I'm still ambitious, but I'm just not, I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm not trying to beat anyone. I don't have any goals as far as like, I want to make this amount of money or I want to be known as the best of this or that. I just don't care about that stuff as much.
Do you think that in order for you not to care, you have to care so much and then reach a breaking point where it just like this doesn't matter?
That's a good question. I mean, there's something definitely disillusioning about doing everything right and not
Yeah.
getting what you wanted. That can open it up for you. There's also, I remember the first time I hit #1, my book, it had been out for 5 or 6 years. It had gotten sort of skunked on the bestseller list when it came out. And then suddenly, 5 years later, it suddenly appeared. It hit #1 on the Wall Street Journal list. And I remember my agent called me and I was mowing my lawn. And my phone rang. I felt it vibrate in my pocket. I turn off the lawnmower, answer it, and he goes, "Hey, buddy, incredible news! You just hit #1. 5 years in the making. This doesn't happen." And I was like, "Oh wow, that's so exciting! Great!" And then, I had to put the phone back in my pocket and finish mowing the lawn. And it nothing changed, like balloons didn't fall from the sky. My dad didn't call me and go, "Hey, I was wrong. I should have believed in you more when you were a kid." Um, my English teacher didn't call and say, "Hey, we should have given you better grades. We just didn't understand." Nothing changed, right? Like you're still that person. And so if you think that these external accomplishments are going to suddenly make you feel good, I mean, just look at presidents as a rule are usually pretty egotistical, insecure people. We think it's the opposite, but what makes you want to be the most powerful man in the world or woman? You want to feel very powerful, and yet we see that they don't ever actually feel that way. They're still insecure. They're still currying favor. They're still mad when people say mean things about them. Like they are still dealing with the same things that they dealt with when they were 13 years old. And so I think understanding that should help you redirect some of that ambition and some of those hopes that you pin on it.
So a lot of young men tend to be discouraged. I mean, this is just like the work of like Richard Reeves and people like that.
Totally.
And why do you think that is in this society, besides like, trying to work so hard at something and then that kind of disappears in their hands, especially in DC where I work, where people are trying to get, this job, that job, or whatever, and then someone else gets it. Not necessarily because they're a skilled worker, but because they knew the right people. They were there at the right, like it all could be down on timing.
I have 2 young boys, so this is something I think a lot about. I mean, look, the system is not working. It's not working for anyone, but for maybe the first time in history, at least in countries like America, it's working better for women than it is for young men, right? Women graduate with advanced degrees more than men. They seem to, their mental health seems to be better. And certainly their perception about their role in society seems to have undergone, as they say, a vibe shift in a way that young men are experiencing the exact opposite. And so I don't think that's wrong. It's statistically and sociologically, it doesn't seem to be wrong. But look, people want purpose. People want meaning. They want work that is fulfilling and challenging. And then also they want to be able to afford to have nice things and have a family. And these are things that I think increasingly feel out of reach. I would argue sort of generationally, these things feel out of reach, but clearly there's something that's not working for young men. I try in my work to explain, like, look, what a demagogue does is a demagogue takes a real situation, a real injustice or real imbalance in society, and it picks someone to blame for it, usually a person not in a position of power, right? So it says immigrants are to blame, or it says the Jews are to blame, or it says Black people are to blame, or, it says women are to blame. And so I think we have a very real crisis and problem in America. And the problem is a bunch of people, many of whom I know, and many of whom know better, have decided that instead of helping with those problems at either a systemic level or at an individual level, have decided to lie to young men and bind them together by pointing at various imaginary common enemies, and that is a very tempting thing to believe. It's also a very lucrative it's also a very lucrative message, right? And so I think not only are we doing men a disservice, sort of sociologically and economically, but we're also doing them a disservice because we are not combating that message with any kind of positive alternative message. So we've essentially ceded the field to grifters and demagogues and bigots and sexists. And I think you see this quite profoundly in the last election. Kamala Harris thought she could win the election by just talking to people who were already for her. And she ceded almost the entire male space, the entire comedy space, the entire self-help and wellness space to these other, politicians and influencers. And as a result, if you're someone who wants to get in shape, or you work a job where you spend a lot of time in the car, or you want to learn about history, or you just want to laugh, the messages that you are getting, the people you are hearing from have a political agenda or have a tendency to platform some of these sort of, more extreme viewpoints in a way that you're not really clocking, and you're not understanding that you are being you are having a worldview. You are being given a worldview that is not going to help you solve your problems or make you better.
So I kind of want to talk about some of those people that are currently in power, that you were talking about, who are not actually helping kind of like young men with the
Sure.
way that they're doing things. But a lot of them are very influential, and they've succeeded in different fields. For example, Elon Musk. I was listening to a podcast you did with Morgan Housel,
Yeah.
and you call it the maniacs. You know, people who are successful, they're maniacs.
Yes.
Should we admire them? Should we aspire to be them? Like they're whether they're, you know, super successful people. Sometimes when you get around super successful people, they're kind of assholes to be around. So should we admire them? What should we look to those people for?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I think you need to be grounded in history, one of the powerful things about being informed about the past is you can see archetypes, you can see personalities happen again and again. And so Elon Musk is singular, but he's also very common in the sense that if you've read about Rockefeller or Carnegie or Henry Ford or Howard Hughes, you're able to see a kind of a fuller picture. And you're able to see that for all the genius, there is usually a wreckage being left behind. Where the, you know, there's a Hunter S. Thompson quote about how he who makes actually he's quoting Samuel Johnson, but it opens Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. He says, "He who makes a beast of himself gets rid of the pain of being a man." And I think Elon Musk is a great example of someone who had, and you can read about this in the Walter Isaacson book. He had a profoundly abusive, traumatic, and awful childhood. And, you know, running from that propelled him to a lot of his early success. And it is also driven him into this vortex of self-destruction and toxicity and anger and all these other forces too. And so I think, you know, if you're interacting with people through like tweets or, you know, Instagram quote porn or whatever, you're getting a very partial picture. And I think, you know, when you have a wider understanding and you have seen the sort of fuller picture, you are much less prone to hero worship and to emulation, because you know that while maybe on net the, you know, contributions of an Elon Musk are positive for society, although he seems to be making a decent go at undermining a lot of them, it comes at an extremely high personal cost, right? There's a lot of wreckage and a lot of pain and a lot of emptiness. And, you know, this goes all the way back to Alexander the Great. There's a series of famous exchanges between Alexander the Great and the philosopher Diogenes. And you realize, oh, Alexander the Great was the conqueror of the world, the most powerful, important man in the world. But Diogenes, who had nothing, who lived in a barrel, was happier, was more self-sufficient, was, you know, more self-aware. And so I think one of the problems is we kind of just live in this snippet world where we're just going, look at how much money they have, look at what they did, look at their rocket landing. And we're not going, you know, how many of their kids still talk to them,
Yeah.
or, you know, that we're not looking at that sort of fuller picture.
Right. Yeah. In Elon's case, especially, like how many families are kind of broken apart and in different, you know, areas, like they're not even together, which is decline of the family is like a socially conservative issue that we're seeing. And seeing someone like Elon Musk on the conservative side is kind of like, well, what happened to the socially conservative values that we see have helped, you know, America, you know, the family,
Totally.
and now they're declining. Yeah. So I want to move on to your book, Right Thing, Right. Well, your latest book, Right Thing, Right Now. What made you switch from, you know, Stoicism to like a specific virtue? And I think in this case, it's justice, right? Or
yeah, so since 2019, I've been doing a series on the cardinal virtues. So I did courage first, then discipline. Right Thing Right Now is about the virtue of justice, and then I'm finishing with wisdom, which will come out this fall. You know, my earlier books on Stoicism were very specific. So I did how Stoicism can help us be more resilient and overcome obstacles. I did, you know, Stoicism and the battle against the ego. I did Stoicism and how do we get stillness and peace and contentment. I was fascinated with the virtues. First off, the overlap between Christianity and Stoicism, I think, is interesting.
Yeah.
Both sharing the same cardinal virtues, um, but but I was particularly excited to do the book on justice because Stoicism is popular with young men, and it is popular in the self-help communities. But it's primarily popular in the sense of what it asks of us. Or sorry, it's popular about what it does for us. And what's less discussed is what it asks of us. So Stoicism that can help make you tougher and smarter and, stronger, that's a pretty easy sell. But what are the ethical components? What are the ethical demands and duties, not just of an American, but of a human being? That's what I really wanted to get into.
You mentioned like the overlap between the virtues with Christianity and Stoicism. Was there any attraction for you specifically, like towards Christianity, because of those kind of like ethical guidelines that were there that seemed to attract you to Stoicism?
Well, I grew up Catholic, and so there was always a familiarity with the virtues. Like I think when I heard them for the first time, like when I heard the term cardinal virtues, I assumed cardinal is from the fact that there are Catholic cardinals, right? Like
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
didn't understand the Latin root of that word. Just means pivotal. So I think there was always a familiarity. We have to understand, like the West. Basically, what happens is Christianity comes out of the like Greece and Rome are ruled by these sort of philosophical thinking. That's the culture. And then Christianity comes out of that. So it's a descendant of it. But then it in turn absorbs and redefines and rediscovers many of these classical thinkers in the Renaissance and in the Enlightenment. We owe the survival of these classical texts in some cases to like Middle Eastern scribes, and also to monks in monasteries who, as a sort of penance, were painstakingly, writing and rewriting these texts so they survive to us. So I think there was always a familiarity in the Stoic ideas. It hasn't made me more or less religious, I would say. I'd probably describe myself as agnostic. I don't believe in God, but I don't not believe in God. I just believe I'm not God, and I believe there's something higher than me that decides what happens. Do you want to call that God? Do you want to call that evolution? Do you want to call that the universe? Do you want to call it a higher power? I don't really care. I do think both my religious upbringing and my Stoic and philosophical education has created a kind of intellectual and spiritual humility that stays with me.
Yeah, and just kind of like a fun fact that you probably already know, but like Saint Thomas Aquinas, a lot of his kind of writings came from Aristotle, and
Yes.
Augustine, like Saint Augustine, I think also drew some things from Aristotle, but kind of went in a different direction. Okay.
I'll give you a better one. Seneca's brother is in the Bible.
Oh, is he really? I didn't know that.
He's the one who lets St. Paul go. He's a judge in the Roman Empire, and St. Paul comes before him, and he lets him go, saying, this isn't a matter for the courts. So if Pontius Pilate had been a Stoic, maybe the crucifixion wouldn't have happened.
But then that goes down a whole nother
Then where
rabbit
would we
hole.
be? Yeah, I know. It was
I was gonna
destined to
say
happen.
Christianity would not exist, and and then salvation history if you want to get theological. It's a whole nother rabbit hole. So just kind of like wrapping up this conversation, which has been so fun for me. So there's a consumer market of habit making products, newsletters. There's like a lot out there. And have you received any criticism for turning Stoicism into like a hustle philosophy?
Well, look, you get criticized for anything. You do anything that attracts an audience, there's going to be some people who are not in that audience or don't want to be in that audience, and that you have to accept that, right? No one is for everyone, and I get that some people don't like what I do. Do I sometimes take criticism for popularizing ancient philosophy? Yeah, but it's also what I set out to do, so I don't feel that bad about it. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
the criticism is is inherently telling me that I succeeded at what I set out to do when I first read the Stoics at 19 or 20 years old. But I would also say, like, if that's what the crime I'm going to be indicted for, like if that's the thing that I'm going to get criticized for, I'm going to consider that a pretty successful life. Like, there are far worse things you could do as a writer or a creator or as a popularizer than take an ancient philosophy built around classical virtue and make it possible and accessible to millions of people. Like that is, to me, is beyond my wildest expectations for what could have happened when I set out. I wrote my first book about Stoicism in 2012. That's when I started writing it. The idea that more than a few thousand people might be interested in this was beyond even my most optimistic expectations. So, like, I'll take the hit, and I'm grateful to be in a position to have even been accused of it.
Well, Ryan Holiday, thank you for joining the Dispatch podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.